Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. I'm Georgina Downer and I'm the host of Afternoon Light and the CEO of the Robert Menzies Institute. The Institute is a prime ministerial library and museum devoted to upholding the legacy and vision of Sir Robert Menzies, Australia's longest serving Prime Minister. On Afternoon Light, we explore contemporary issues relevant to Sir Robert's life and legacy with leading thinkers from around the world. Thank you for joining us today. Well, welcome. And in today's episode of the Afternoon Light podcast, I'm joined by Ian McAllister, who is a distinguished professor of political science at the Australian National University and has, since 1987, been conducting the Australian Electoral Study Survey after every single election. So really, Ian, what an amazing contribution you've made to the flourishing of Australian democracy. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation.
Well, it's great to have you on the Robert Menzies Institute's podcast. And I think it's so interesting to reflect on the changing nature of Australian democracy since the Menzies era and his retirement in 1966. Could you tell me, to start with, how do you characterise the main differences in voter behaviour from the Menzies era to today? Are there strong differences? Are we a very different people 70 years on?
It's almost as easy to say what hasn't changed. What hasn't changed really is the way we vote. We still vote with a paper and pencil. Yeah. Until relatively recently, we all voted on the same day. Since 2016, there's been early voting. The technology and the way in which we vote is the thing that's constant. Virtually everything else has changed. So political parties, as you mentioned, have changed the way people identify with them, people's trust in the political process. Leaders have changed, the role of leaders, the way information is disseminated through election campaigns has changed, how different groups within the population engage with the political process, for example, younger people and so on. So there's really been huge changes. And probably what I would say is that the major institutions in Australia, the political institutions, electoral institutions, really haven't kept pace with a lot of these changes. Not just in Australia, I should say, but a lot of other countries. So we still have a 19th century institution in terms of the electoral system, somewhat modified over the years, but everything else has changed.
Yeah, it is amazing that we still use a paper and pencil to vote, just as sort of a basic kind of technical aspect of our democratic system. And of course then have to count with real people. There's no automation, and that's despite the fact there have been various reviews about bringing in electronic voting, but I think people see all the downside risk and the upside risk just doesn't quite add up.
Well, when we ask people in our surveys what would make it easier for you to vote, and we ask them questions about if you voted during the course of a week or electronic voting, things like that, the majority of people say they want electronic voting. On the other hand, when we ask people what form of voting do they most trust, it's paper and pencil.
Yeah.
So the technology has really not kept up in terms of convincing voters that this is actually the way to do it. There's two types of changes we need to look at. One is e-voting, which is simply turning up to a polling place, voting electronically rather than filling out a paper and pencil. That's actually quite widely used now around the world. The technology for that is pretty well established. It's been used in ACT elections and various other places in Australia, but it's used widely in Europe. The other one, which I think is going to be the big change in 15, 20 years, is i-voting, which is the ability to vote, say, on your smartphone, to vote remotely. And given that, you could really vote at any time during the course of an election campaign. At the present time, there's only one country in the world that uses i-voting, and that's Estonia. They
Really?
experimented with a few elections back. It worked quite well, and they've been using it ever since. Now, the interesting question about i-voting is we've had this trend towards early voting. So round about 40%, 42% of the population in 2019 had voted before polling day.
Yeah.
And I would have thought this time it'll probably be well over 50%. Yeah. The nature of democratic accountability in election campaigns is that we all cast a vote on one single day and we make a decision about what the parties are offering us. Once you have lots of people voting at different times during the course of an election campaign, you're sort of undermining that democratic accountability. And it undermines the nature of election campaigns because political parties don't quite know when to release their policies. When do you have a leaders' debate? Maybe if 30% of people have already voted by week 4 or week 5 of the election campaign, what would be the party strategy for that? Now, I actually think that voting is the answer to that because it would allow people to vote remotely but on one single day.
Right.
But as I said, people basically don't trust that at the moment, and I think it's about a decade or more away.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we've recently had to trust our iPhones a whole lot more than we have in the past with our private information through the check-in requirements that the various state governments in Australia have imposed on people. And, we're basically giving up information about where our movements, where we shop, where we eat, where we borrow a book or whatever, what we do. Some days I was checking in maybe 20 times, and that is private information. I mean, okay, your voting intention is a little bit different from your shopping preferences, but still that sense that you do trust your iPhone, your smartphones a hell of a lot. Banking apps, all those sort of different apps. Why not voting?
Well, I think this will change. It will take some time to do, but I also think just talking about trusting iPhones, trusting government and so on, we do have a very compliant political culture.
Yes.
So we've got a utilitarian political culture which focuses on the greatest happiness, the greatest number, essentially very Benthamite, rather than a rights culture which is maybe Lockean, focusing on individual rights and freedoms. And that's why compulsory voting works so well. And again, we ask in our surveys, do you support compulsory voting or would you prefer voluntary voting? We find that consistently 3/4 of voters support compulsory voting.
It's interesting.
And the proportion of voters that would still vote under a voluntary voting system is well in the 80s. People say to me, well, that really can't be true, and so on. And there are international examples of that because the Netherlands used to have compulsory voting. They abolished it in 1971. Their turnout dropped to about 83%, I think it was. So our turnout would still be internationally one of the highest. But we do have a very compliant political culture. And I rather suspect if there was a bipartisan agreement to trial e-voting and I-voting and so on, and people basically got the hang of it and they had a degree of support for it, I actually think it would happen. But it's probably a couple of generations away. Yeah,
it will be a generational question too, I would have thought. The millennials down, I think, will be fairly relaxed, but baby boomers and above might start to think, I'm not sure if I trust, even I'm Gen X, I think there'd be some in my generation who'd be a bit leery-eyed of it. Just a final question, though, on I-voting and e-voting, Ian. In Australia, we have compulsory voting, but my understanding is it's compulsory to attend the poll. So you have to have your name crossed off, but you don't actually have to vote. You could write a rude word. In fact, I've scrutineered on occasion, and there have been a few rude words and some interesting illustrations on ballot papers that I've seen from time to time. So that's the tricky thing, isn't it, with an electronic vote? How do you spoil your ballot paper electronically?
Yes, I think that actually is an issue. The proportion of people, it probably has to be said, that really spoil their ballot paper for political reasons because they don't like the process or they don't like any of the candidates is really very, very small. Yeah. Most people spoil their ballots in Australia because they make a mistake, quite simply. And that's not unreasonable because you've got very complex electoral systems, some of the most complex in the world. You've got different levels of electoral system between different types of government. You've got compulsory voting, so you're driving everybody to the polls, and there's As I mentioned in our surveys, about 15% of people probably wouldn't bother to vote. And then on top of that, you've got a very large proportion of non-English speaking migrants as well. So I'm actually surprised the level of spoiled votes isn't higher. The number of people who, as I say, spoil their votes for political reasons, very small. One of the things people have trialled around the world is having a against all option. So that would be one of the options on the ballot paper. That was something that was trialled in Russia in the very early days of democratization. And on 2 occasions, against all actually won the ballot. And then they had to have a reballot.
Then they abandoned democracy.
And then they abandoned the against all option because they thought that was too dangerous. But there are other countries around the world that do actually use it, and it gives people the option of saying, well, we don't want any of these candidates. I rather suspect that wouldn't be required. The benefit of electronic voting is that it would really cut down on spoiled votes. And we have these incredible Senate ballot papers, which are some of the largest ballot papers in the world. Whenever there's an election here, I always get various emails from my colleagues overseas that study electoral systems, and they say to me, can you get me one of these, etc. And they frame them and put them on their wall because these you don't see anything like this anywhere in the world.
No, they can be a metre long, can't they? They're just incredible. Yeah, extraordinary. Ian, just wanted to move our discussion onto political campaigning per se, and we're, of course, on the cusp of an election being called here in Australia and, of course, about to be, depending on where you live, inundated with campaign techniques and materials. And I guess some people will try and avoid it at all costs, but those who are politically interested will live and breathe it for the next few weeks. In Menzies' days, so in the 50s and 60s, was political campaigning less sort of presidential than it is now? We very much see the Prime Minister or the opposition leader front and centre of the campaign, for better or worse, depending on their popularity, of course. What about back in the Menzies era?
Well, the big change that's happened over the last 30, 40 years has been the personalisation of politics and the focus on leaders. Most of that is being driven, as you would assume, by the electronic media, particularly television. So you really didn't get that in the past. It's probably worth just going back a step because Australian elections are really quite different from elections you find in other countries. The two functions of political parties are to mobilise and convert, to mobilise people to turn out to vote and then to convert them to vote for your cause. Because of compulsory voting in Australia, political parties don't have to mobilise.
That's true.
So they focus on conversion. Now, in Menzies' day, conversion was done through newspapers, radio, through town meetings, leafleting, things like that. With the rise of television, conversion has become a national function for political parties. So they do it through television, but also, of course, more recently, it happens through social media. And we've done quite a bit of research in the election study asking people about how they follow the election, what are their sources of information and so on. And 2019, for the very first time, the greatest proportion of people said they got their campaign information from the internet rather than from television, radio or newspapers. And this is really a sea change. It's also a generational change as well because the vast majority of these people tend to be young. Political parties are getting a bit more adept at all of this. So they're now micro-targeting through social media. It's also worth saying that this is something which has benefited independents and minor parties to a much greater degree than the major parties because the barriers to entry are much lower. 20, 30 years ago, television, you had to have a lot of money to have television advertisements. These days, somebody sitting in their bedroom can set up a social media site and start micro-targeting and contacting people on Facebook and so on. So that is a major sea change. And it means that the major parties and also the minor parties and independents can identify very small groups of voters and try and convert them to their cause. And that's something that's never happened before. And really the sort of long-term consequences of that are really still being worked out because it's still relatively new.
Especially for our two-party political system, which, the major parties will, of course, advocate the benefits of. It gives you a clear choice, a stable option. We have very, very rarely had minority governments here in Australia. I mean, you go to Israel, Italy, they have coalitions of sort of 11 parties and, it can fall apart at the drop of a hat. Or, I know in the Netherlands, didn't they? In Belgium, they kept having to have elections to try and get a government formed. Whereas in Australia, it's very clear. It's either the blue team or the red team, and the same in the United States. But with are independents then more of a force now than they've ever been in Australian politics? I mean, there have been independents, in times gone by, and famous ones and less famous ones.
Well, because we have a majoritarian electoral system, that really creates normally a winner. In fact, almost always there's one party that has a winner. Where people tend to protest against the major parties in terms of their vote is split ticket voting, as we call it. So they vote for a different party in the Senate as against the House of Representatives. And that trend has been increasing considerably. It's now around about almost 1 in 3 voters vote for a different party in the Senate as against the House of Reps. That in itself wouldn't be a particular problem in terms of governing, except the Senate we have is very powerful. So it's one of the 3 or 4 most powerful upper houses in the world. It can introduce legislation, stop legislation, and so on, very much like the American Senate or the German upper house or the Swiss upper house. So that can have a major effect on governing together with having 3-year parliaments, which is a separate issue as well. On your point about political parties, having 2 major parties and so on, having election campaigns that introduce a whole series of issues which can be generated through social media and so on is really not something the 2 major parties like. When you have 2 major parties competing, what they like competing on is a single economic dimension. So you get one party more in favour of collectivism, another party more in favour of private enterprise. And that's a debate that's bargainable. It means that it can be moved, there can be nuances of all of this and so on. Parties can move to the centre, they can move slightly off to the more extreme ends of it, but it's essentially bargainable. Once you get other issues being introduced, and classic issues tend to be things like abortion, same-sex marriage, things like that, moral issues, euthanasia is another example. These tend to cross-cut the support that the major political parties have. And it's very dangerous, and it's why the 2 major parties always try and constrain debates to economic issues, management of the economy, spending on health, education, issues like that. Independents, minor parties, quite often will take particular stances on moral issues.
Yes, that's right. Run on one particular issue and not have a view on anything else. There's certainly historically been a sense that some voters were completely and utterly rusted on to a political party, and the party could rely on the so-called base. I understand from reading your research that has really come down quite dramatically. This sort of, I think it was 14%, was it, in the last election, voted always for the same political party. That's tough for the political parties because they don't have that nice sort of buffer of who can you take for granted. Why do you think that's happened, Ian? Is that related to the independence, to the rise of the internet, social media, a more educated voter?
Well, I think it's related to all of those things. It's related to underlying changes in Australian society, not just in Australia, but internationally. You mentioned education. You've got huge proportions of younger people going through university education, which gives them a different outlook on life, makes them much more critical citizens. So we tend to call them instrumental voters in the sense that they're looking at party policies, they're making quite informed judgments about policies that are going to benefit them. In the past, the majority of voters tended to be expressive. So they tended to have a quite emotional commitment to a political party, and they just voted for that party during the course of their whole voting lives. And you did mention the statistics on voting volatility, which is really worth repeating. When the surveys started being conducted in the late 1960s by Don Aitken, and we continued after 1987, around about 3 out of 4 voters never changed their vote from the very first election they voted in to the last election before they died.
It's amazing.
So there was huge stability. These days, that figure is around about 45, 46 percentage points, and I would have thought it would have declined a bit, or will decline a bit at the next election. So you've got a huge degree of voting volatility in there. You've got many more critical citizens who are looking at policies. They're much less inclined to follow the partisanship of their parents, which was the major thing that was determining people's voting behaviour 30, 40 years ago. They're looking at policies, and they also tend to be cross-pressured. So we've had the rise of identity politics. So people see themselves as being members of all sorts of different groups.
Yeah.
So you might identify with an ethnic group, you might identify with a particular income group, a professional group, trade union, something like that. And this is creating a series of cross pressures within the election. 50 years ago, if we looked at class voting, it was blue collar versus white collar. And you could add in a very small proportion of people who were involved in farming. These days, you've got multiple class groups. You've got people that are involved in different social networks. You've got people who are in traditional blue-collar occupations that supervise other people in the workplace, who are self-employed, who earn quite a lot of money, who own assets like self-managed super funds, housing. The class structure these days is diversified to a huge extent, and that's really a major change. And of course, it makes it very difficult for the political parties when they're crafting policies. And we saw that in the last election when Labour's policies were really increased taxation to affect the assets that people had built up over time, superannuation, housing, homes people had bought for an investment, things like that. And of course, that was one of the major factors which affected the Labour vote, why they didn't win the election. And it was really ignoring this really complex nature of the class structure and people's economic interests.
That is really fascinating how Australian society has become a whole lot more complicated. I mean, at a very basic level, Australians, I think, would like to think we don't have we're a classless society, and we don't have the sort of rigid hierarchies like our friends say in the United Kingdom in Britain. But Menzies' whole political philosophy, creation of the Liberal Party, was designed around these so-called forgotten people, the middle class, the people who weren't part of organised labour, trade union, that sort of working class, and weren't part of a group of vested interests, be it country, agriculture. They were the shopkeepers, the sort of everyday people that he spoke to, and clearly it was an effective form of rhetoric to galvanise a very significant group of people in Australia to support him and his government for many, many years over. We can't say we have easily say we have a middle class anymore. I mean, I know this has sort of changed over time. We've had Tony's tradies, Scott Morrison's Quiet Australians, list goes on, the Howard Battlers. So it's hard for a political party to identify a single group or a single kind of class of society that it can rely on for votes or look to win the votes of.
Yes, that's right. And it makes it very difficult in terms of party strategy. And it's one of the reasons why political parties these days are very wary about putting forward a series of policies which are going to benefit one part of society rather than another. And again, in our surveys, we find that an increasing proportion of people see no difference between the two major political parties in terms of policies. And I think that's quite right, that the They are essentially campaigning on what we call valence politics, which is we all agree everybody should have a job. We all agree that tax should be lowered. We all agree that the country should do well as possible economically. And the real issue is competence, which political party would be more competent in achieving those goals. So the debate is a bit less about policy itself, about the goals. It's a bit more about the competency that the political leaders and so on have in achieving that. And that again brings us back to political leaders and the importance that they have these days in terms of people empathising with them and having a sense of trust and a belief that they can actually deliver the various things that voters actually want.
It's interesting the question of trust, because you hear both sides of politics always questioning their opponent's leader for their trustworthiness, saying they're completely untrustworthy. And I think voters probably end up rolling their eyes because they hear it so often. But that must resonate in their focus groups, that if you keep pushing this line that someone is untrustworthy, you can't trust them to manage the economy well or manage their health system well or the pandemic well, then, as you say, you've got to, as a voter, you're making a decision about how well can these people manage. And I know a criticism of some of our recent political leaders, I think on both sides, has been this is a managerial class. They're not full of vision and values and aspirational ideas. It's about how well can I manage, the country. May as well be managing a bank or some large organisation. So it's different to the politics that I grew up with, and I'm sure the politics you grew up with, in where it was a real competition between quite clear ideologies, quite clear different philosophical outlooks on how to run society. Would you say?
Well, it's interesting you mention perceptions of leaders and so on, because we've done a lot of research on that in the election study, and we ask voters what sort of qualities they see in the leaders and what they think is important. There's a lot of international research on this as well. Basically, what voters want in leaders is trust and integrity. To a lesser degree, they want competence. They're not particularly interested in leaders that are charismatic or have a great deal of compassion or empathy. Trust and integrity are the two things they're looking for. So they want to have a party leader, prime minister there, who they can say can actually deliver. And one of the things we've seen in our surveys since we started asking this battery of questions in 1987 is that the leaders from election to election exhibit less trust among voters. I mean, voters just don't see that in them. Now, there's an interesting question in there, whether voters are becoming more critical and they have greater expectations of leaders, or whether the leaders we've got sort of post-Howard, post-Rudd and so on, really aren't as good as the leaders we've had in the past. And I don't really know the answer to that question, because it's very difficult to compare, because you've got different leaders all the time.
Sure.
But you do see it very clearly in our surveys. There is this really incremental decline over the years. Howard, and to a lesser extent Rudd, were the last two leaders that people thought they had a degree of trust in. And since then, it's declined considerably. For example, Bill Shorten in 2019 had the lowest rating for trust in any of the leaders we'd ever polled. I think we polled about 30, 35 over the years. But whether that's the leader is not as good or whether voters just want more is an interesting question. I probably just should say that in terms of voters' expectations, again, we ask a question in our surveys about people's dependence on the state, or do they get some form of direct benefit. These days, around about 60% of people get a direct benefit from the government in terms of a pension, family tax benefit, something like that. And that's really a huge change. I mean, the intervention of the state in people's lives in terms of giving them something directly. So people do really look at that and they see that could be affected by a particular party in office and so on. And I'm sure that resonates with how they view the political leaders.
Yeah, that's really interesting, of course, in the context of the budget that was delivered earlier this week, and the sort of sense that you might get something if you vote for a certain party, right in your hip pocket a cash payment or a tax deduction. There are economic reasons for those policies and the budget, of course, but that also is partly a political tactic. I'm interested in, and sorry, just going back to the class discussion, that in your study it's showing more and more Australians identifying themselves as working class, which is strange, because I don't think that can be right in terms of, the definition of working class is you're basically working in unskilled or very semi-skilled labour, whereas we have a highly skilled population, highly upwardly mobile. We have obviously a big take-up of tertiary education, but also vocational education through apprenticeship. So why is it that people are identifying more and more as working class? Is that a change in the definition and how people self-identify?
No,
and that doesn't matter for voting intentions?
Well, it's class self-image. It's the self-image people have. And that's really something, Australia is essentially a very egalitarian society without class distinction. So when you use that idea of, say, somebody who's working class being manual worker and so on, or a tradie, something like that, most tradies would earn very much more than the average academic and so on. So, all of these traditional class distinctions really don't matter anymore. No. So I take those class self-image distinctions really with a pinch of salt these days, because I don't think they matter. What matters much more is the sort of social networks you have, how you use your money, if you put it into particular assets. So things like trade union membership, the type of job you do, you supervise other people in the workplace, these matter much less these days than they did in the past. It's much more networks, it's much more how you use your money, and things like, for example, share ownership in Australia is one of the highest in the world. It has been declining a bit since the GFC, but it's I think it's surpassed only these days by Switzerland and maybe one or two other countries. So popular capitalism, in the sense that Thatcher talked about it, has really taken off in Australia. And we drill into our surveys and look at that. We find a large proportion of people that own shares, 5 or more shareholdings, tend to be people that traditionally we might have thought of working class before. Tend to be tradies, skilled workers, things like that.
And so you've observed this idea of asset-based voting, which speaks to what you were just talking about then. So are people then really voting according to their financial interests, or are we still seeing a philosophical approach to politics? It sounds like it might be the former rather than the latter.
No, it's very much more an instrumental approach. We saw that very much in 2016 when the Liberals put forward their policies for changing, for example, superannuation. I don't think there was really an appreciation about how many people that actually affected. Around about 1 in 10 of the population on paper have a self-managed superannuation fund according to the ATO, but we ask it in our surveys, it's about 1 in 3. Wow. And of course, what it's affecting is people in a household. So you yourself may not have one, but somebody in your household, a parent or a sibling or something like that, may have one. So the political effects of that were much larger. And again, in 2019, when Labour put forward a series of policies to tax investment assets, such as houses and so on, that was affecting about 1 in 3 of the population. And again, disproportionately people who didn't necessarily have a civil public service job, something like that, with a defined benefit, but people who were relying on their own assets to create superannuation. And you've probably observed in this election, both political parties have backed away very considerably from any changes to any of those. Just getting back to, you mentioned about economic voting, hip pocket nerve and so on. One of the things I've been sort of surprised by over the years, going back 30 years actually, is the extent to which political parties believe that stuffing some money in people's pockets is going to change how they vote. We know from the research we've done, all of the international research, it doesn't work.
So this is the direct cash payment rather than a sort of structural change.
If you benefit people personally by a tax change, or you don't benefit by somebody by trying to take money away from them, it's not necessarily the thing that's going to affect their voting. It's what we call egocentric voting. The thing that will affect people's voting economically is whether or not they believe that change will benefit the national economy. So the mistake that Labour made in 2019, I think, was not linking their tax changes and saying this would actually be a benefit to the country as a whole. They didn't make that connection. And people just saw it as something that was not going to benefit the country at all. It would have no benefit at all, and they didn't vote for them on that basis. Voters are actually a lot smarter than I often think politicians believe, because they do look at national interests and national economy, and they're a bit less interested in their own personal economic circumstances in all of that. And that comes back to the whole pork barrelling debate about putting money into electorates and so on. I've done research on that, looking at the sports rorts and so on. We find absolutely no effect for that whatsoever. And I was intensely surprised by that. I thought I'd made a mistake in terms of my statistical modelling, went through it all, looked at all of that, could find no effect whatsoever. And it's just this belief that politicians have that if you benefit an electorate by putting some money in, that it's going to increase the vote. It's not true.
Well, I can say from first-hand experience being a candidate in a hotly contested electorate, I didn't see grants to sporting clubs as shifting the dial at all, or that type of local level grant. I think people were, as you said, they were interested in very big picture issues, or if it was an infrastructure spend, it needed to be one that touched a very large portion, like a major road or a hospital or something that was quite a large scale project rather than just a netball court or the like. So it's interesting that those sort of small scale grants, they've been with us for a long time, but why are they done if they don't work? I mean, that's the question here.
Well, I think politicians don't read the academic literature.
Oh dear.
Going back to 1993 election, the unlosable election, I remember when there was various advertisements in the newspapers about how the tax changes would benefit you personally, and you had a grid and you could look along at your salary and look at the dollar amount. And I was aghast at this because it wasn't linking it to the benefit of the national economy. And of course, not surprisingly, the Liberals lost what was considered to be the unlosable election because they didn't make the connection between that change and how it would benefit the national economy. Labour made the same mistake in 2019 by the proposals they made to tax changes. It wasn't linked to how it would benefit the national economy. So you have two examples, 30 years apart. If somebody read the academic literature going back to the 1980s, then they would find out what they should do and what they shouldn't do in terms of the economy.
I wondered if we could finish our discussion in by talking about democracy itself, which, often attributed to Winston Churchill incorrectly, that democracy is the worst system except for all the others. But the trust in democracy, satisfaction with democracy has declined. That's widely known these days throughout the Western world. Is that of concern? I think, especially in the context of what we're seeing in Europe at the moment, authoritarian Russia invading Ukraine, this sort of real, once again, challenge between the authoritarian world and the liberal democratic world. Are we happy with our system? Does it? The alternative looks pretty awful to me, but maybe for some people in Australia it looks okay. Should we be worried about that, or is that just the ebbs and flows of democracy, and we'll get out okay the other side?
It's probably worth saying that satisfaction with democracy in Australia is still high if we compare it with a range of other countries. We had the high point in 2007 when Labour was elected, And at that level, we were, along with Denmark, Sweden, various Scandinavian countries. Since then, it's declined consistently at each election, but we're still at the halfway point.
Right.
If we compare the advanced democracies, we're in the middle. The interesting thing about people's perceptions of democracy in Australia is that we don't necessarily trust politicians, and we can see that in our surveys. Increasing proportion of people don't trust politicians and so on. But we still have a very strong sense of efficacy. So our sense that we would be treated as well as anybody else, this sense of egalitarianism, is as strong as it's ever been. If you look at the data in the United States or in various European countries, both trust and efficacy have declined. In our case, only trust has declined. And again, when we drill down into a lot of this and look at it in our surveys, people still very much support the principle of democracy, but they're a bit less keen on the process of democracy and how it actually operates. And that particularly pertains to the debate about younger people and democracy. And there's been a lot of debate over the last 10 years or so that younger people are turning away from democracy. It's not true. They have a strong sense about the principle of democracy and they see it as the best form of government, but they're a bit more hesitant about the process of democracy and how it actually works in practice. And I think a lot of that really comes back to the act of voting, the political parties, how they operate, and so on, which are not really keeping pace with the sort of expectations that younger people have.
And I guess for future generations, that's where there are reform opportunities of how we vote, of how political parties operate, how they interact with the public and when they're in government, what sort of restrictions placed on them. So, a podcast for another day. But thank you so much, Ian, for your time today. I appreciate this is entering a really, really busy period for you, but it also is such an important time to have these discussions with someone of your huge experience in the way politics operates and the way people vote in Australia. So I do thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
The Afternoon Light podcast is brought to you by the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. You can find more about the Institute and our podcast at robertmenziesinstitute.org.au. We're also on Twitter, on Facebook and LinkedIn. We look forward to you joining our show next week. Thank you.